My name is Pete Damiano, Director of the Public Policy Center, and once again I want to welcome everyone to our evening session of our what used to be called Policy Matters class and is now officially called Equality, Opportunity, and Public Policy in America, which is basically our attempt to expose students and also members of the public in these evening sessions to a whole variety of important public policy questions. Tonight we're going to be talking about the topic of inequality and poverty, and obviously that touches a whole variety of different public policy topics, and we're very pleased to have an excellent group of panelists here with practical experience, and that's what these evening sessions are really for, to get you out of the classroom and hear from the people who are living these things, and we hope you appreciate that. And with that, I will turn it over to Professor Brooke.
Thanks, Pete. So this is our third in the series of 4 that we'll have in this class, so you guys kind of know the drill of how this works. I'll introduce the speakers by name only, and they will have some introductory remarks which will tell you about their role in their current organization or agency, or the position they hold, and some of the things that they do in that role. So we'll hear from Wendy Rickman, Joe Bolcom, Marianne Dennis, Natalie Veldhouse, and Brian Lauren, in that order, if you don't mind. Sure.
Hi, so my name is Wendy Rickman. I work for Iowa Department of Human Services. And in that organization, I'm currently the division administrator for the policy division. So my division sets eligibility policy for FIP, cash assistance, temporary assistance for needy families, the block grant, for food assistance, for Medicaid, for child care, for child welfare services, protective services of kids, and then for dependent adult services. I've been at DHS about 30 years, so I'm at that old place where I started at DHS as a child abuse investigator many years ago, and kind of worked my way up through the organization to my current role that I've been in. I've started to count my age in legislative session years, because it's kind of like dog years. So I'm starting this year my 7th session with the legislature in my current position. So that's what I do, and kind of what we're responsible for in my division at DHS.
Good evening, Joe Bolcom. I'm a member of the Iowa Senate. I live here in Iowa City, over on the north side, usually on the east side. I'm serving in my 18th year. Before that, I was on the Johnson County Board of Supervisors. And my policy interests in the legislature that are on health policy, environmental policy, tax policies. I serve on 6 different committees. The state's doing some things good. We've got a few policies in place that are pretty supportive of people that struggle against need. We have about 25% of Iowa households today that pretty much just eking by week to week, meeting their basic living needs, 25%, which is a huge number. And we're probably home to 40–50% of all our kids. So we have a lot of kids living in families that are struggling. And when kids struggle at home with poverty, they struggle in school. They have other challenges. And I think one of the big challenges for the state is making sure we have a safety net in place to make sure our kids are successful. And some of the people on the panel can probably talk a little bit about that. Let me hit 2 things that have been really helpful to supporting family income. One is earned income tax credits, a federal credit, refundable in families with a couple of kids with making under $45,000 a year. When they file their taxes, they can actually get a refund of $4,000 or $5,000. Imagine that in April, getting a check for $4,000 or $5,000 has the effect of lifting people out of poverty. The state has improved its earned income tax credits built off the federal. We spend about $73 million a year to support about 210,000 families, which is home to about 40% of these kids that get this cash benefit from the feds and the state. The other thing that we've done as a result of the Affordable Care Act, also known as the Obamacare, which ran this raging debate about repealing it, it's been really, really a good thing for the state of Iowa with providing health insurance to a couple 100,000 people that didn't have it before. If it goes away, I'm not sure what we're going to do. These are adults, 80% of whom work full-time. actually, Obamacare is a huge subsidy to employers that don't provide insurance to their employees. And when we have this conversation about taking it away, you think about kids and think about adults in the workforce, parents of those kids that won't have health insurance. How many of you are on your parents' policies? That'll all go away with Donald Trump, right? So, or repeal and kind of we've got into these buzzwords around it. So, or if you have a pre-existing condition, that'll all go away, right? So the Affordable Care Act said if you've got a pre-existing condition, the insurance company had to provide insurance. Obamacare goes away, that goes away. So there are still about 20 states that didn't expand Medicaid for low-income adults. Iowa wasn't one of them. So two really good state policies, earned income tax credit, and a strong Medicaid expansion. I'll stop with that. There's a lot more to talk about. I'd like to know what's on your minds.
Hi, my name is Mary Ann Dennis, and I work for a private nonprofit called the Housing Fellowship, and we act as just like a private housing developer, except we're nonprofit, so we're able to access, well, a lot of private developers don't like to access public funding to develop, build, or buy and rehabilitate homes. That's what we do. I've been with the Housing Fellowship since 1993. I was actually the first employee hired. My husband thought I was nuts, but I really wanted to be the boss. And so that's actually what ended up happening. Anyway, what we do is we provide affordable rental homes in Johnson County for very low-income families. And so we either build those homes or we buy existing houses and then rehab them and people within. We currently own 171 rental homes. By the end of next summer, we'll probably have close to 200. And the interesting thing is, to me, the families that we serve, all of them have children. As Joe said, stability and having a safety net for families is very important. What I believe is that if folks can afford where they live, and more importantly, if they like where they live, then they stay. And what that does is create stability for the kids, for the parents, for the neighborhoods, and ultimately for the community. The 83% of the heads of our households are employed full-time. However, the average income last year was a little bit over $20,000, well, about $21,000. So you can imagine a household of four subsisting on about $21,000. We do charge rent. A lot of our households receive public assistance. So what happens is it's a federal program called the Housing Choice Voucher. You'll also hear it called Section 8. And what that means is the families go in and say, this is my income. The federal government says you can afford to pay this much money. They pay about 30% of their income for rent, and then they get a federal subsidy every month that comes to the landlord. So that's what we do.
I am Natalie Veldhaus. I am the Community Food Project Coordinator at the Crisis Center of Johnson County. The Crisis Center has many programs, but I work primarily with the food bank program. I work with schools in the district to try to open school food pantries in schools that have a high free and reduced lunch percentage. I'm also currently pursuing my master's in social work, and last year I served as an AmeriCorps Vista with the Crisis Center, and I coordinated research efforts for the Johnson County Hunger Task Force. And I also got my BA in Ethics and Public Policy in 2015, and I was in a class pretty similar to this, like a couple years ago. And so based on the Hunger Task Force research that we completed, the Crisis Center has recently piloted a mobile food pantry that's visiting 3 different mobile home park communities, and we're looking to expand food pantries in middle schools and high schools throughout the county. So that's most of what I do, and if you want to hear more about Hunger specific to Johnson County, or what to do when you're done with your undergrad and you're looking at like some kind of national service program, and we can talk about that kind of stuff too. So thanks for having us.
Good evening, my name is Brian Loring. I'm the Executive Director for Neighborhood Centers of Johnson County. We are, as Mary Ann's organization, we're also a private nonprofit. Despite the fact we have county in our name, we are a private 501c3 nonprofit. We're kind of an organization built upon the settlement house model. So we have a couple of centers in Iowa City, both located in neighborhoods that have a fair number of low-income households. We do a number of kind of support services for those families and work with those families in a variety of different ways. In our centers, we provide, basically we do a lot of childcare for families, working families in the neighborhood. So we have infant through preschool classrooms in those buildings. We also have a core of home visitors that go out and visit folks in their home, particularly folks who have young children, making sure that children are on track developmentally and getting supports to those families if they're not, and encouraging children that are on track to improve and make gains to prepare them for kindergarten. We also have a lot of programming in the school, so we do what are called before and after school programs. Many of you may have participated in those in your earlier days. But we also, in those programs, work with the school district to provide 21st century programming, which is kind of academic and enrichment supports for kids who are a little bit perhaps behind in their math and reading, to try to get them up to speed. And we do that throughout the school year and in the summer as well. So in any given day we're visiting, we have probably 500 children in program and probably another 30 or 40 adults that are in program. We do a lot of, in addition to the before and after school programs, we work also in the junior highs and high schools. We have a program called G-World, which is targeted at self-identified minority young women, and really, I think, hopefully works on some of the issues that were identified by the Public Policy Center in a recent study they did on how children were in Iowa City schools were feeling unwelcomed. Minority kids in the schools were not feeling particularly welcome in those schools. And so one of the goals of that program is to really try to build connections between the schools and among both children in the program and as well as connect them to resources in the school and in the community. So we have kind of a broad range of things, and there's a lot of stuff going on at the center, and it would probably bore me as much as it would you to go into some of the detail of that, but it's certainly not an exhaustive list what I've provided, sort of offered up here today, but we do a lot of things, and we are I think one of the things that makes us unique is that we do pride ourselves on being responsive to emerging needs in the neighborhood. So as things come up, as we see refugee populations moving into the community, we try to be responsive to the needs and try to bring those new groups of folks into the community and try to connect them with resources and help them strengthen their natural networks of support so that they can be successful and be a part of the community and, as Mary Ann said, get settled and become stakeholders in this.
So before I open it up to questions from you guys, be thinking about who wants to ask the first question. I'm going to pose a couple questions to the panelists. You don't all have to answer the questions. The first question is, what do you see as the most pressing need in the area that you're currently working in? Or what do you see as the biggest challenge moving forward? Something you're trying to do and something that is challenging in trying to do that.
I'll go ahead and start. Most pressing need, I mean, I think it's still remains adequately funding our public education system. And so what does that mean? It means that at the state level, we decide how much money we put behind every kid in the K-12 system, and we also decide if we're going to have a decent preschool program. We have one now, kids can get 2 hours of programming, we need a full day. And So it's really a debate around resources and priorities and making sure we fund our schools. And not only schools like this Iowa City Community School District, but when we don't adequately fund our schools, it really hurts our rural schools, places where we have what we call declining enrollment, where there's fewer kids year to year. And we have special supports for those schools to keep them going. But when the legislature does a lousy job funding our public schools, I think it really drags down our ability in the long run to have productive workforce, productive communities, and people that can get ahead.
Well, I'm a little bit biased, but I think the largest need right now is for more affordable housing. You think about the last 25 years in Iowa, the rents in this area have increased by 35%. However, the median income has decreased by 13% for renters. And there's very little affordable or available affordable rental housing for families. Nothing against, we love the University of Iowa, but the students take up a lot of the rental homes because the university doesn't provide a lot of student housing. And so that also then tightens up the market and makes the rents extremely high. So that's the biggest need. One of the biggest barriers that we've run into, and I don't know, this was in Cedar Rapids the last couple of weeks, I don't know if any of you have heard or read the Gazette about the Common Bond project that was trying to build housing in Cedar Rapids. And they were going to build multifamily 45 rentals. 5 of those homes were going to be for previously homeless families. And the neighbors pretty much convinced the city council to say no to that project, even though the city sold them the land. That's what we call NIMBY, not in my backyard. And that's one of the biggest barriers for affordable housing because people do not want the poor folks to move into their neighborhoods.
I would say the biggest issue that I see in the world of food insecurity is really just that families aren't making enough money to meet their basic needs. I mean, these things are all connected. A lot of the families that we see probably are the same, and they can't afford their housing even though they're working full-time, or they have a random medical expense that comes up where they're just not able to meet their basic needs. And so visiting the food pantry isn't like, oh, great, free food, I'm just going to show up and eat this food. It's like I can't meet my basic needs, so you pay for your rent and you pay for your medical bills and you don't have enough left to pay for food. So I would say it's hard for me to choose between housing or wages or what's most important, but really families are just working with different patchworks of services that are not completely serving their needs. So
I would agree with, I think housing is a critical issue, although it's not something that we provide. I mean, I think that's housing, wages, and the other thing I think is often overlooked is consumer protection. I think there's a lot of people have, particularly for vulnerable families, I think there are folks out there that have figured out ways to leech money from people, and I think that there's not a lot of places for folks to turn or regulatory controls over some of the ways we conduct commerce in this country and in this state. So I think that's another issue that I would throw out there. I mean, for us, one of the things that we run up against is childcare related stuff. I think in order for families to be successful in the workforce, they have to have quality, stable childcare, and so that's one of the things early on. And talking about public policy in the mid '90s, there was a huge reform of welfare that, in a sense, really moved people into a workforce without necessarily having the superstructure, the infrastructure in place to provide childcare. And so a lot of, one of the things that we tried to address early on was to move into that area, just simply to provide that childcare for people so that they could be successful in work. And so one of, there was the Child Care Assistance Act was reauthorized a couple of years ago, and there have definitely been some improvements in Child Care Assistance, which is the kind of a federal program, state program that helps pay for child care for low-wage working families. And so there have definitely been improvements, but yet there are still some things that I think could be improved, and we would like to see that happen. There's things that maybe could happen at a state level that would help families maintain their child care.
So real quick, let me, I've put things that we think about at VHS in a couple different categories, at least around this question. The first is kind of logistical, technical stuff, and that is the availability of state resources to meet a lot of these needs. So, Senator Voltham can correct me, but I think, last year legislatively, when we talk about public education, school districts were given about a 2.5% or so increase, which everybody knew wasn't enough for what they needed. On balance, though, that represented about 85% of the new revenue coming into the state. So that left 15% of the new revenue coming in to do for everybody else. So I think there are just logistical issues from a resource perspective that cause us some constant kind of tension. On the more philosophical side, though, I would say there's an ongoing conversation in Iowa about why people are poor. One of the things that I do in my division, whenever I'm interviewing somebody who wants to do policy for me, is to have that conversation about why do you think people are poor? And there's kind of two schools of thought around that, and then probably some stuff in the middle. There are folks that think that people are poor because of their circumstances, that there are things that just pile on and pile on and pile on to the point that they cannot get themselves out of their situation. I think there's another school of thought that people just aren't working hard enough. And in the Midwest, a lot of times that has that, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. I didn't have much when I was a kid, but we may do, that kind of thinking. The reality is, the people who access benefits that are available through DHS, which are a lot of the things that these folks talk about, a huge majority of them are working. And many of them are working not just one job, but two. And they are still sitting in what are, for us, basic safety net kind of situations. So they may be working two jobs and still under 145% of the poverty limit, which is our basic eligibility criteria, for example, for childcare. So the misperception sometimes about why people are poor and whether they should be helped, whether you work with a carrot or a stick, whether you're trying to support people or beat them into doing better with their jobs and their education, is, I think, fundamentally kind of a policy question that we go back and forth on in Iowa. And for our agency, it is something that we talk about quite a bit. So, I'd say technically, it's the amount of resources that you have to throw at all this stuff. You can only prioritize with this size of a bucket so many things. And then philosophically, it is, are we really our brother's keeper? Or are we standing in the grocery store looking to see what that person who's paying with food assistance puts into their cart? They're kind of two different ways to think about it.
Questions?
I'm on the staff of the Daily Iowan at the University of Iowa, and I've been working with City Council on housing stories, kind of. So I have a question for you, Mary and Dennis. And it's, in Johnson County, what are the biggest barriers to affordable housing for low-income families?
For the families?
Yeah.
Well, the price of the rent.
Okay.
Wow, that's pretty good, you guys.
I just have to get warmed up.
In class, we talked about different ways to try and lift kids in particular out of poverty. And one of the more popular ones we talked about was two-generational sorts of policies in which you try and help out the parents, and then that will translate into helping out the kids. Would all of you in general be more supportive of that kind of type of policy, or just more direct funding of like kids programs?
Well, I'll answer that. I think that the most, research shows that the most successful programs are 2 or 3 generations, probably 2 generations where we can find funding. So we've tried to tailor our programs to address that. I think one of the issues that we run up against is that very often when you're looking at particularly public funding, we tend to want to categorize it and compartmentalize funding so that often, for instance, grants that we receive will want to target one or the other and not both. But there have been moments in time, and there are certain funding streams out there that we're able to tap into that allow us to do kind of the 2-generational approach. And I think that typically is the most successful. We used to do a program, there was a federal program called Even Start a few years ago that we had for many years, and it was President Obama eventually killed it. I think the research did not show that it was a particularly successful program overall, although I think we found it to be incredibly successful. I think one of the issues was it was often implemented in schools, and schools are not always the best place to do 2-generation programs, and we, at a neighborhood centers, for instance, had pretty good luck with it. And the issue was, the basic notion of the program was that you're working on early childhood growth as well as trying to, for instance, if a parent did not speak English, we would offer ELL classes at the center, or if they needed to did not have a high school diploma, we would offer GED classes at the school. So there was a little bit of a thing that happened in those programs where you would see parents who had a really horrible experience with school. Everything about school was awful, right? Their life in school was, being bullied or being just kind of a horrible experience, and somewhat you would see that attitude and that kind of that feeling, those feelings about school being passed down to the second generation. So one of the things that this did was to kind of light a fire with parents around education, trying to get them excited about education and stimulate their interest in education. And you didn't see, it's not a Disney movie, it didn't work every time with families, but very often you would see a parent who was having success in ELL class or a GED class and watch their approach to their child and how, they suddenly decided that education was in fact valuable, and that did translate from parent to the child. So those kinds of programs are not readily available any longer, but it's one of those things that I think we found great success with and try to put together patch quilts of funding and resources to carry those kinds of programs on.
Yeah, I think you got to do like 10 things at once, or maybe 50 things at once, right? You have these acute needs of families today, childcare, moms at work, dads at work, childcare is needed, they're living hand to mouth, they need the food pantry, they might need a subsidy for housing. But it's pretty clear the more educational attainment people get, the more opportunity they're going to have to make an income that can support families. So a lot of effort around upskilling people. The governor just appointed some future Iowa group to study how we can get more people in our workforce with 4-year, more than a high school degree. We have one of the lowest states in the country, and only about 25% of people in our workforce have college degrees. So we have this huge opportunity. So you gotta provide. And we do a lot of this through the community colleges, specific training and specific kinds of career paths. I think this group is looking at about in 2025, like a 600,000 person deficit in terms of available jobs and skilled workers in Iowa, right? So if you're an employer and you need skilled people, right now you can't find the people you need. There's already a few 100,000 folks, right? So you got to do training. But we're coming out of the worst 6 years, under Governor Branstad, the worst 6 years of K-12 funding in the last 40 years. And we've made some decisions to give away state tax revenue to large out-of-state corporations through this massive property tax thing we did, that this year, Wendy suggested we only had so much money, and a lot of it went to education, but we also sent off about $300 million in property tax cuts. A lot of it went out of state, places like Walmart, Menards, and Home Depot. So we made a choice about that, and then we kind of shorted ourselves where public universities are concerned. I mean, we've had the worst 6 years of funding to the public universities and colleges also. So if at the end of the day we need an educated workforce, we've got to do the acute, immediate stuff to keep families going and supported, but we've got to have a much more robust effort and encouragement of people to hang in there post high school doing more training.
I think Joe's right, you have to do lots of things at once. And just so you know, the neighborhood centers, the crisis center, and the housing fellowship, we all collaborate with each other. There's several nonprofits that are all doing different things, but are in contact with each other, and we sort of know what everybody else is doing.
All right, I actually changed my question. This question is now for you, Joe. The goal is to increase the amount of four-year education, college-wise, why is there no effort in trying to create policy limiting the hikes on tuition? Because they keep on going up and it makes it less of an option.
Good question. I mean, I think historically in Iowa, the legislature and the people of Iowa have made really solid investments in education, right? We have 3 really good public universities. We have a strong community college system. I think we generally think, although I think sometimes we think we're number one. We're really good at thinking we're something we're not. We're number one at thinking we're number one. And we're slipping. I mean, it's pretty clear in education we're slipping, and it's largely due to these investments. In terms of college tuition, public university tuition, the relationship is what's the state appropriation and the balance between the state appropriation and tuition. And when the state has money, it's been relatively generous until recently with the public universities. We've had, and I shouldn't say too recently, we've had actually 15 kind of up and down years. Although, as you know, we've had, 2 years of the tuition freeze. The tuition freeze was basically, we just said to the universities, eat this. We didn't give them, there was like no money in exchange. We used to have this thing called a salary bill. We haven't had that for 6 years. We have state employees get raises, people on universities get raises. We used to acknowledge that and recognize that, especially at the University of Iowa. If you want to keep really talented faculty and researchers, there's a national, international market for those people. And you have to be competitive to keep the best faculty that people want to study with. So we've kind of fallen behind on that. And I'd say if you look at the tuition here at Iowa compared to all our peers, President Harold would say something like, well, we're about $1,400 cheaper than our next Big Ten peer. And I say to President Harold, there's a reason for that. Because we want to make it affordable for Iowa families, and when we have 25% of families barely getting by, there's a reason we should have affordable tuition for those families. And that notion that we should just inch up slowly because of this national ranking or this Big Ten ranking, I don't subscribe to that idea. I think we need to pay attention to what's going on here. So while I'd say it's still a pretty good bargain here, we need to pay attention to make sure that the state's appropriation to our universities remains strong, because the Board of Regents and the presidents, they all wait to see what the legislature's going to appropriate, and then they generally decide is there going to be a tuition increase and what is it. We do a crappy job appropriating money at the state level, but the likelihood of tuition going up is greater. The K-12 system, by comparison, we can't really, public education, K-12, you can't really raise tuition on second graders, right?
Give me that milk.
And when you look at the Medicaid program, when you look at our healthcare part of the budget, they're called entitlements for a reason. Somebody has a disability, we've decided we're going to take care of them. That budget kind of has grown over time. So you've got that budget, you've got the K-12 budget, and lo and behold, when it gets time to fund the universities, and there's not enough, we turn to the students and the families to make up the difference.
Why do policies and organizations that deal with poverty address families different than adults that don't have children?
Well, one basic reason is that we do put an emphasis when you're talking about safety net services on families who have kids, because you're kind of aiming that toward kids. So we actually have a category that you're talking about. We call them ABODs, able-bodied adults without dependents. And there are different policies around those folks because in general, again, the idea is if you're able-bodied and you're only taking care of yourself, you should be able to be employed. You should be able to work your way through. And so they've been kind of left out of that safety net program in general. To the senator's point, one of the pieces that's really important of the Medicaid expansion that came with the Affordable Care Act is that ability for single people without dependents to become Medicaid eligible. And that wasn't very easy before. And so we're insuring a lot more of those folks than we were before. I think the other thing we try to do is pick them up. For example, Natalie's probably familiar with our education and training program, which is available to SNAP folks, so people who get food assistance. And it gives them some special options when it comes to entering into an education program that improves their education, or a job training program that'll improve their skills. In Iowa, we've chosen to center that program on able-bodied adults without dependents. So we do try to pick it up on the back end, but the general public policy perspective is that we're going to deal more with families who have dependents than able-bodied people who are out kind of making it on their own. Does that make sense?
More questions? You already asked a question. Who else wants to ask a question after Isaac? Irvin. Oh yeah, after you.
So we know a lot of these families have these problems and stuff like that, and going back to what you said about that not in my backyard mentality, why is it so prevalent, and is there any way to like kind of dispel that attitude towards poor families?
Well, that's a really good question. I have not been able to figure out why it's so prevalent, but I can assure you that it happens every single time somebody trying to do an affordable housing project in a neighborhood. To dispel it, I think what we've done is we largely do scattered sites. So we also, and this is sort of our philosophy, we don't have open houses. We don't think that it's anybody's business that, we don't think that the neighbors need to know that here come the poor folks. Because what happens is, what I've always said is, somebody sees me on their street corner with a paper trying to figure out if I can get the land or something, and they all go crazy, and once the houses are built and the people move in and I'm out of the picture, they're all happy. Because really, what happens is, once they meet the families and the kids play with each other and the families are more stable, it seems to go away. Except in the instances, I think, when it's a real large multi-family project. Although there's a pretty successful one, I think Pleasant Ridge has been actually pretty successful. When you get, what is it, 250 apartments in a small area, things happen. Things happen in neighborhoods. dispelling that myth, we actually, in Johnson County recently, created another 501c3 called the Affordable Housing Coalition. And we have a committee called Unity, which is yes in my backyard. A couple of things that we've done, we took, the city of Iowa City gave us a bus, and we took a bunch of people, we filled the bus, and we just drove around and said, where's the affordable housing? Because you really, hopefully if we're doing our jobs right, you're not gonna be able to tell. And, you know, we had banners on the Corridor Strip that said things like, you know, we provide housing to people who work at the University Hospital. We provide housing for people who work in the schools. 83% of them work. So anyway, we had these posters or these banners on the street corner that said, you know, there's a nurse, I can save your life, but I can't be your neighbor, that sort of thing. People always talk about education. I get a little bit frustrated because we've been trying to educate them for a long time.
I think that a similar question came up last year, as I recall. And I think one of the things that we talked about was just how we're able to kind of, you know, how folks with resources are able to separate themselves from people who are less fortunate. And I think then, you know, if you don't have opportunity to interact, you don't, you know, if you're not part of a church where you go to interact with folks who are low income, you know, that I think it's easy to start demonizing or feeling uncomfortable with that population. And I think Mary Ann's exactly right. I think that, you know, we on my block, and you know, Colin used to live over there too. I mean, she has a house that is right in the neighborhood, and I would suspect that nobody in that neighborhood really knows it's a fellowship house. And those kids interact with everybody else in the neighborhood, and so I think that really just creating an opportunity for people to come together and have conversations and, you know, get to know people who are lower income. We just don't. I think we've done a pretty good job of segregating ourselves from lower income populations, and I think that sort of creates more mistrust and more that sense of the other.
Yeah, I don't necessarily just limit that to people who have resources being separated from people that don't. In general, over the last couple generations, I think, and in Iowa, not as much as probably in some of the bigger urban areas around the country, but we in general just don't know our neighbors as well as we used to. You know, if I was out messing around as a kid and did something 3 blocks down, by the time I got home, my mom knew because somebody called her, right? Wendy's out here goofing around with the back fence, or she's, you know. That kind of thinking has kind of started to diminish, and the way that it plays out from a public service perspective will be things like, you know, we'll get a call on the child abuse hotline and somebody will say, hey, these new people just moved in down for me and they're letting their kids play out in the alley, and cars go really fast down that alley, and one of those kids is going to get hit by a car, and I want you to, that's child abuse. I want you to come talk to him. And part of our conversation is, have you walked down the alley to tell your new neighbor who's new to your environment that this is a dangerous situation for their kids? And a lot of times the answer is no. So they'll turn to kind of a public entity to come carry that message. That's not the way the world used to work, you know? It used to be a situation where if somebody knew, and thank God, you know, when I first moved to Des Moines, it was a big city for me. And we pulled up in the driveway. Somebody from across the circle backed up. Her name is Pam. She's one of my best friends ever. She pulled up next to our car and said, I see you're new to the neighborhood. I'm going to the store. What do you need? You know, I know how hard it is. Would you guys eat a chicken if I brought that home? And the relationship in the little circle I live in has been like that ever since. That is missing in a lot of neighborhoods. And I think as long as we continue to keep ourselves separate or see ourselves as different than, whether it is different than folks who may have less than us or more than we have. I heard a fascinating conversation the other day about the Hillary Trump phenomenon and how vehemently people believe in their candidate and how vehemently people believe that the other candidate is so bad. And how the heck did that happen? And the discussion was exactly to Brian's point. I can sit in Clive, Iowa, everything I need from grocery stores to churches to medical care, everything that I have is within about 4 blocks, 5 blocks, 6 blocks. I can watch MSNBC all day and only hear the liberals, right? I can be on this path where the only social media, or I get all my news from social media. If I want to only listen to liberals, I can do that. I do listen to Fox News just to see what my dad's up to. So I switch back and forth. I'm like a maniacal flipper because I'll listen to Fox News and I listen to MSNBC. And a lot of times you can't tell they're talking about the same topics, right? It's totally different. So I know that's like a really long answer for a short question. But seriously, if we don't start reaching out and getting to know each other again, the polarization that you're seeing, whether it's in campaigning or social service provision or public policy development, if I have to disagree with everything that Joe says just because he's a Democrat and I'm a Republican, we will never fix it. And it goes all the way down to house, dorm room to dorm room, apartment to apartment, neighborhood to neighborhood kind of thinking. I just think it's really important. And whether you guys get into social services or not, you're all going to live in communities. And the people that you know and the people who know you will keep you safer. They will keep you more satisfied. They will keep you more enriched. It's only if you sit by yourself that things get kind of miserable and mad,
Sorry. Okay, so he stole the question that I was going to ask. We discussed how some groups are affected disproportionately by poverty, including women and children, but also minority groups such as Blacks and Latinos. Do you think that there is a racial issue at the heart of Not in My Backyard in Johnson County and in general?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Totally. Historically, it's interesting because some of we get money from the city, state, and the federal government. And when our statistics were coming out, and if you look at the minority population in Johnson County, when I first started, Black people were very few, like 3 or 4%. However, historically, the heads of our household, the majority have been Black. Okay, and it's so interesting to me because the people that would come in and monitor our programs, the people that gave us the money, would say, "This is great. This is great." And then if you look at the single moms that live in our home, 80% of them are single moms. And I would always say, I'm sorry, I don't think it's that great. Because what is it? What is it about that? I do think that minority communities do have a tendency to seek out each other, and I think there was sort of word of mouth. Some of it is that, the housing fellowship has nice houses, you ought to get one of those, that kind of thing. But I also think that there's targeting from property owners who, and that, I think that's been proven a couple times in Iowa. They'll test, they'll send Joe and I out and say we want an apartment. If we're Black, they say no, it's not available. And then, Brian and Natalie go out, they're white, same apartment, same income, same everything, and they get an apartment. That goes on. But yes, and but the other thing is when the folks who oppose a project present their opposition in public, they don't use those words. They never say that. They never talk about low-income people. They never talk about, we don't want the black folks here, we don't want the Latinos here. They say it's traffic, water pressure, property values. So they couch it in other things, even though there's really no proof that any of that stuff happens.
I think one of the things that, that I would recommend you guys go look at when you're just looking for something extra to do. There was a PBS special some time ago, and it was called Race, the Power of Illusion. And it's a several-part series that kind of walks through the history of America as it relates to other cultures and ethnicities. It is a riveting kind of thing to watch, how it is that systematically this country has developed around the issue of race and the issue of ethnicity. And I think structural, institutional racism exists in Iowa. And in our agency, we see it manifested a lot of different ways. The easiest probably is to talk about child welfare services, so child protective services. When I first kind of became aware of the issue, as I said before, I'm kind of old. So when I went through social work school, we talked a lot about cultural sensitivity, right? That was the term we used. And when the NAACP came to me the first time and said, "You have a problem," it's like, how can we have a problem? We love people. I serve to help people. How can we have a problem? And she looked at me square in the eye and said, "Young woman, you may be culturally sensitive, but you are not culturally competent." And I was like, "Oh crap." So I had to kind of sit back and think about that. So that was kind of the next phase of evolution as it relates to our work with families. The current conversation that we're having with folks is more around being culturally humble and understanding that I cannot understand what it is to be African American or Latina or Asian or the myriad of other cultures that live in Iowa. So we talk a lot about being culturally humble, and what we see in that is when we first started having this conversation probably 10 years ago in child welfare, African American families in Iowa made up about 6% of our population. They made up almost 34% of the child welfare population, which means that we were taking custody of those kids and keeping them much longer in the system than we did Caucasian kids. And when I talk about stuff like this, it is not to blame anybody about it. If you take a young woman coming out of social work school who was raised in a typical nuclear family with a mom and a dad and a couple siblings, very often they live close to or maybe far away from their grandparents, and you ask them to go look and join with a family who may have 3 generations living in the same house, everything feels chaotic. We equate that as being risky. We equate that as being a child safety issue, as opposed to taking a more culturally humble perspective and understanding that these 3 or 4 generations of family living in the same place help each other. They support each other. Kids learn from their grandparents. Kids are enriched by that experience. So it's the difference between what I learned growing up in the family I grew up in and placing those values on every family I see, and being able to take what I learned as part of a family, but listen to what folks are telling me about the strengths and needs of their family, and being humble enough to say, that's what should drive my actions. So it exists. It exists in police departments. It exists in social services. But I always try to figure out, what the hell are we going to do about it? Because we cannot get better if first we say it doesn't exist, or we argue about whether it exists. We got to move on to how is it that you fix it. And from my perspective, that comes from sitting in rooms together and having very courageous, we call them courageous, hard conversations. The ability for somebody to look me in the eye and say, you are not culturally competent, was very gutsy, right? The ability for me, it took me a while, I'll be honest, to sit back and reflect on it and think, well, crap, what am I gonna do about that now? That's the way you start to make movement in some of this stuff. So why does that happen in neighborhoods? Because they don't know each other. They don't sit together across the table. They don't see each other in the same restaurants, in the same churches. They're not seeing the value of that great cultural kind of fabric that we become when we're all together and learning from each other. I mean, how many of you guys like Mexican food? And, you know, my favorite part about living in Des Moines, I can eat Moroccan, I can eat, right? And I can not only eat that food, but mix with those families in a way that's different. You either see that as enriching, or you see it as scary. And what we have to do if we're gonna be a state that continues to grow and our young people don't just get educated here and leave as soon as they can, is to embrace that fabric and that conversation.
Thank you.
More questions? Don't be shy. What do you want to ask? Who wants to ask a question after? Somebody has to go. You guys have already asked questions. Okay, I'll let you guys ask more questions.
I want to follow up on something that Brian started talking about on the sort of consumer side. And because I know this is very close to Joe's heart too, and that's sort of how expensive it can be to people in terms of, you know, not only the share of your income, of course, things like housing costs, but the sort of predatory behaviors, payday lending, that sort of thing. So I wonder if you could talk about your experience with those sorts of institutions, the policies that might be.
Yeah, I mean, people work hard for their money, right? I mean, we all do. But people that make, you know, low-wage jobs, they work really hard for their money. And they gotta be really good managers of it. And most are, actually. When you don't have a lot of money, you have to think about things a little bit harder. I know I occasionally make a bad financial decision and I have the capacity to withstand it, right? But if you're living week to week, you know, you gotta make all good decisions. We generally think that government is going to protect us from schemes, right? And, you know, across the country, there's this thing called payday lending. We have it here in Iowa. There's about 250 locations where you can get a 350% interest loan for 14 days, $500, and people go that, you know, living week to week, my car breaks down, I need $300 to repair it, I show up at one of these shops, I take out a loan, it seems like a sweet deal. You gotta have a job, you have to show pay stub. 14 days later, you gotta come up with $300. Well, you don't have $300, so you go back and you take out another loan, you pay off the loan you have, and then 6 months later, you've taken out a dozen loans, basically, to try and retire that first $300 to fix your car. So very predatory. We've had very little success with doing much about it. It's been Bill's introduced. We did have success with another form of predatory lending, car title lending. Anybody from Illinois? Illinois has something called car title lending. So you take your car title, you need a couple, same example. Let me say, your car needs a repair, or your child goes to the doctor and you got a $200 doctor bill. You take your car title, you go to one of these same shops, you get a 300% interest loan for the $200 you need to pay the doctor's bill. You know, you get 14 days or maybe 30 days to go back with the $200, get your car title back. Your car title's your collateral that you're good for the money. If you don't pay back the loan, they take your car title and somebody comes and gets your car. So not only are the loans very expensive, but you also have the added bonus of maybe losing your car. We had that happening in Iowa for about a year, and then we muscled the support when Democrats were in control of the legislature and the governor's office to run them out of business. So that if we had car title lending, you could go, there'd probably be 250 places to get a loan today. And what's interesting about both of these forms of predatory lending is people migrate to them. I mean, people really like, if you go to the banking division, which oversees this, they don't have any complaints, right? Why do you think they don't get complaints? who wants to talk about how much money they have in their checking account today? You know, who wants to talk about their financial position? Most of us don't. And so if you show up at one of these payday lending places, it's like kind of embarrassing for some people. So they don't complain about it a lot. But it's a really bad thing. So that's one example, I think, of where people kind of get ripped off. I know in some places we have these things called food deserts where there's not a decent grocery store and people have to buy food that's really expensive at Casey's or Come and Go or those. So that's an issue for people, not only the quality of what they get, but the cost of just basic food. We need to do a better job of making sure people work hard for their money to keep as much of it as possible. And from a tax perspective, we have really low filing rates in Iowa where you have to start paying taxes at a ridiculously low amount of income. That's something that could be made more progressive in Iowa as a policy. If you're a Wells Fargo customer, geez, you could be at any income and be getting ripped off.
Yeah.
On the state or national level, what do each of you believe is the biggest misuse of spending on public aid policies, and how could each of you work to fix that misallocation?
Well, I think we're pretty, in Iowa, I think you guys did fact sheets on how generous Iowa was from FIP and et cetera, food stamps, SAP. So I don't think we're very generous. So what could be done better? I suppose there's a few people getting things that maybe don't qualify, although Wendy's shop does a good job of eligibility, trying to root that out. We spend a lot of money on healthcare in Iowa for kids that aren't insured, for adults that aren't insured, because of the crazy healthcare system we have. I think it's pretty clear that if you have healthcare, you're going to be healthier than if you don't. Anybody think the opposite of that? Yeah, if you're sick and see a doctor, you're going to have a better chance of life living. So we want people to have insurance, but it's not cheap, right? I mean, Medicaid, the governor privatized it and turned it over to 3 Wall Street companies to manage for us because it was getting too expensive. Healthcare is expensive because people are drinking too much, eating too much, not moving around enough. I think here, and getting older.
I just felt very guilty all of a sudden. Anybody else get that feeling?
You feel like you're talking about
Yeah, so I'm just saying, healthcare costs are increasing because we have a chronic disease issue. We've got a lot of people out of shape, so people that want to complain about Obamacare or whatever. I mean, here's the healthcare system right here. Here's Obamacare right here. Obamacare is this little piece of the healthcare system. So you can replace it with whatever you want, but we're still going to have pressure on our safety net programs and on regular old employers like the University of Iowa who provide health insurance.
Joe, what do you think about things like, or in the healthcare arena, there are a couple things I tell you. Medicaid, number one, has grown in cost at less than half the rate of private insurance. So if you think about Medicaid kind of as an insurance coverage kind of situation, the cost of Medicaid actually has grown much slower than private insurance kind of stuff has. And so I wonder sometimes about things like being able to better negotiate drug prices or some of the things that were a little bit of a hands-off kind of piece of the Affordable Care Act that I just wonder about that kind of stuff in terms of what drives those costs. I don't know.
I know, Joe, you might want to talk a little bit about tax credits.
Yeah, I mean, there's another part.
Pull the string.
Looks like the electoral come down.
No, so, here's the state budget, right? It's all its money, $7 billion this year. We spent about $450 million in the tax code to all sorts of stuff. right? We spend more than that, but the tax credit. So John, think about it as what's the next new shiny object for creating jobs in Iowa, right? And so that spending gets very little oversight. You know, we have committees that oversee the education funding, how much for healthcare, transportation, public safety, courts, all the systems, right? We decided every dollar we're going to spend. The tax stuff's kind of over here. It's kind of all automatic. And we have really big companies getting like millions of dollars from taxpayers. We now have Google, Facebook, and Microsoft here in Iowa. They have data centers. Data centers are these big computers that store all our pictures on Facebook, right? And other stuff. And these companies don't pay any taxes virtually in Iowa. We gave them hundreds of millions of dollars in incentives to come here. Some of the richest companies in the world. Great, they're here. They hardly provide any jobs. These data centers eat a lot of electricity. And we have cheap electricity, so they came here and we gave them all this money. So then we don't have money over here, or people really think it's cool that we have Facebook, Microsoft, and Google here. They think it's really cool. And it's like we're spending tens of millions of dollars that aren't available to support kids or to make public education, deal with tuition increases here at the university, right? Because we've given up so much money. And, you know, there's disagreements about that. I mean, it's a political decision to create a new tax credit. This year we created a 10-year credit, $10 million a year. It's a $100 million decision to try and figure out how to make biochemicals out of waste products at ethanol and biodiesel plants. Okay? It's like the next thing. It's like 2 years, all the business groups, every business group in the state got behind this thing. We don't have any money, the state's kind of broke. It's like, why are we doing this? So the big guys, they get stuff. So this was like ABM and John Deere, like everybody, every lobbyist in the Capitol was for this. And it passed. 49-1.
Who voted against it?
Like my perception, you were talking about not in my backyard, kind of, like not understanding other people, not really relating to other people. I feel like this is kind of part of that. And if you could discuss, I guess, your experience with the idea that there are people who don't want to take care of their kids, who don't want to educate their kids, people who, government assistants, or, who are, like somebody said, what are you putting in the grocery carts, when you're using TANF, or food stamps, and so that kind of thing, is like, you're not taking good enough care of your kids, or you don't want to take care of your kids, and that's not why you're applying for government assistance. Do you find that is true ever? And if it is, how often?
I would say at the food bank, people don't come to the food bank because they're having a good day. It can be really hard for families to come in and admit that they need assistance because it's just such a bedrock value in America is just providing for your family. So admitting that is really hard. And there are a lot of misconceptions about what hunger looks like in Iowa. Hunger is a lot of people who are experiencing hunger in Iowa are older. They're like 65 years and older, or a lot of it is kids. So people think, oh, who's hungry? And I just say, think about like your grandma or your grandma's friend, or a kid in an elementary school. There's just, people don't know who's hungry because people don't talk about it. You don't say, oh, hey, I can't afford my groceries. It's like, hey, how are you? Good. No one says that. And it's hard to combat that. We have people who will say, oh, look at that car that's in the food bank parking lot. Why does that person have that nice car? And food bank clients say those kinds of things about each other. It's not just people who are receiving services and people who aren't. People are kind of focusing on each other, but it's kind of like, that's kind of the least of our issues, are people who are using services looking at each other and saying, why do you have that and why do you have that? We need to be looking like up like what Joe's saying and being like, what's going on up there? That's where the real issues are.
Yeah, I've been in child protection now 30 years, right? So, I mean, I'm so old, if I ever get carded, I say my shoes are 21. Seriously. I can tell you, it took you a minute, but you got there, didn't you? Okay. So, I can honestly say that I can count on less than 5 fingers the number of families or the number of individuals that I've met in those 30 years that really don't love their kids, where there's something really wrong. The families that I meet, when you ask them what it is that they want for their kids, the reason that I always listen so closely to Senator Volcom is, you know, I've done hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of family meetings, and when I ask families who are involved in child welfare, what is it that you want for your kids? The first thing they tell me is I want them to graduate from high school. I want them to be successful. I want them to go farther than I went. At the point that they can talk about that, then really we have them, because that's where we want to head. You know, we want them to be successful at it. One of the issues with that, when we talk about child protection kind of stuff in particular, and child safety issues, the system response to child abuse kind of things is to separate kids from their families. So we go out and we do a removal. And if you've ever been anywhere near a removal, it is the most heart-wrenching, gut-busting situation that you ever go through with a family. Even if you're taking that kid from something that is a bad situation to something that's better, the pulling apart of people who depend on each other and who love each other is totally gut-wrenching. And so when we talk about child protection, the response of the system is to take kids from their families. Okay, so if you think about that long term, the error in the way that we've been going about our business, all in the interest of keeping kids safe. So it's not coming from a bad place. But if we ever want to get out of families' lives, we want kids who are protected by their families, not from their families. So the idea that we immediately go in and separate people and we spend a ton of time trying to keep people apart in the interest of child safety, in the end is not a very successful way to run the railroad. Because if we want better families, if we want more functional families, we want these kids to be protected by their families rather than protecting them from their families. You know, it's the same conversation we have around people who get FIP or food assistance. I talk to folks every day who are on these programs and who would like nothing better than to not do it. There are very few people sitting around proud of the fact that they're getting public benefits. And the perception of them is so much different. I laugh all the time with legislators because, you know, Marianne and Brian and Natalie and I, to the extent that we deal with legislators, we come with our data. If you guys go on our DHS website and look at our budget book, we'll talk to you about the average family who gets food assistance and the fact that they really get about $1.68 a meal, right? So we try to put those facts out there and we go to the legislature and we're all armed with our data to talk about our families. And there's always somebody sitting at that table who will say, yeah, but I know a guy who. So we call it the I know a guy who standard. Because whatever data you come with, it can be set aside by one bad experience or one person who has a stake in their cart and pays with an EBT card. When I was a kid, I was on food assistance. And in Montana, where I grew up, it was kind of a weird thing. We got commodities. So you'd stand in line for cheese and macaroni and butter, right, that kind of stuff. And then they kind of went to food stamps. So you stood there with your little food stamps and had to count them out. And you know, checkers would look at you like you were wasting their time, and it was a weird deal. And we had people stand there looking at our cart to see, once we pulled out those food stamps, what are they putting in there? What they didn't know about our family is that we had Christmases where all of our presents were food. Chocolate licorice, that was my thing, wrapped up with a bow, because that's what we had. And so, again, to the extent that we look at something like that and draw a conclusion about their family values and their family likes and dislikes and their family abilities, we're doing the wrong thing. We're doing a disservice, and we're just not gonna get any better. So in general, do our families want to be on public assistance? They do not. The average stay with FIP is about 1.5 years. Now, if you listen to the press, I hate to sound Trumpish, those damn press people, right, press? Right, you hear about all these people who are on FIP for life. That does not occur. It just does not occur. It's about an average of about 1.5 years. The average family is a mom with 2 kids. She's working at least 1 job. That is not, and she's white, so let me tell you that. She's not African American or Mexican, or, you know what I mean? Until we start really listening to that and internalizing it, I think we're gonna continue. I don't meet families who don't love their kids. I meet families who either don't know how or have had such a hard time having enough resources to keep moving that it becomes a problem. But I don't meet families who don't love their kids.
One thing that I've learned in my job, and I was very fortunate. I grew up in a family and had a lot of support. What I see is a lot of young women who have children who have no support system, none at all.
Or they burned all their bridges.
Right. When I was in social work school, I remember when I was in graduate school, you know, if I needed a winter coat, my dad, I could go home on break and my dad would buy me a winter coat. I see a lot of families who, there's no support system. And they have little kids. And it can be, I don't have kids either, so I don't know. But I would think that at times it can be really stressful to have children and not have, and to be their only caretaker. So I think, you know, like Wendy was saying, instead of removing them, I mean, try and get them some support. And it's, I think it's best, and I don't know if we do it, but I think it's best if the support sort of can look like them. You know, I know with youth homes that have the Teen Mom houses, which is one in our neighborhood too. I was really impressed because the counselor, if I go into a Teen Mom's house, I'm like grandma, or great-grandma, actually. But if the counselor sort of looks like the mom and dresses like the mom and, is as cool as she thinks he is, she can provide better support. Same thing with facilities, which is hard, and that's also something that's hard to do in Iowa.
I don't think there's any my experience with going to families or vulnerable families is, they love their children as much as anybody else. They, as Wendy and Marianne have talked about, I think they're subject to more scrutiny in a lot of ways. And so, they're unable to shield themselves from that scrutiny, because they are in public assistance or they're, folks know that they're receiving Section 8 housing or whatever. And so I think there's a great deal of scrutiny on those families. I'm sure there are plenty of, there are families probably where you've got, serious mental health issues or whatnot, but having said that, I don't think that's limited to just low-income families. I think that runs the gamut of all incomes and all ethnicities and racial categories. So.
To the degree that the grocery store aisle is where a lot of scrutiny takes place, which, who looks at what other people buy on the shelf? Does anybody do that? I think we all do. I do, right? And like a couple of years ago, I did this minimum wage challenge, right? And I lived on for like 7 days. It was like $88. So I went to Aldi. So I took pictures, I put on, I posted it daily, right? Here's what I ate, but I went to the grocery store and I posted these pictures of what I bought on the belt, and then I actually made 2 grocery store trips, and I ended up I bought a 12-pack of beer, okay? It was like $8 in hams. And I didn't have money for better beer.
It's on sale, right?
Yeah. And, but I got like, that week, I had like 500 people comment on the stuff I bought through this, like, I got like 5 days, I wasn't able to do it. Because I had to pay for transportation, all the, it was like, here's your minimum wage job, here's your food budget, but it was extreme, it was intense how people were like commenting on everything that was on the belt, and why'd you buy that, and one of the reactions was from a few people that live in poverty, who saw what, that were like, it was like this wake up to me, how angry people were. There were several people were super angry about the fact that I was trying to do it, just like doing this thing with other elected officials. But it occurred to me, people that do live in poverty, it is a hard life. And, somebody posing to try and do this, there were several people who were like, what's wrong with you? Why are you doing this? And then, of course, the incredible scrutiny about what I bought. So we get distracted, I think, and Brian said it, we kind of get distracted by what the real issues are for families and for people that live in poverty. We want to nitpick, they've got a bag of potato chips in there, and, people do live in the world and want some pleasure in the world, right? Anybody not? Okay. I don't know, Ham's beer, I don't know.
Well, the other thing is, it's really cheap to feed your family at McDonald's. It's very cheap to feed your family at McDonald's. And, there's a lot of scrutiny about poor people eating at fast food joints and the quality of the food and the nutrition and stuff, but cheap.
So since we only have a few minutes left, I thought I would pose the last question that I thought might sort of dovetail or sort of wrap up some of the things you guys have been talking about. So a lot of what you're doing and what the students are learning in class is all about the challenges that people are facing and where our public supports meet their needs and where they don't. So the question is either how would you go about increasing awareness of the challenges that low-income families and children face, or alternatively, why aren't these issues talked about more in the public and policy spheres?
The people that live in poverty don't have a voice. We're talking about policy. There's a pretty good example. I think I was instrumental in creating the Housing Trust Fund. And so there was a group of us that all from around the state that went to the legislature to try and get a dedicated source of financing for a local housing trust fund. And we stuck at it, but to finally get that, it took us 12 years. So it's not something it's not that we didn't talk about it. It's not that folks in the legislature didn't talk to us about it. Sometimes this stuff just takes a long time. And, it's just not easy. But in my world, I talk about it all the time. So I don't know that people don't talk about it. Is it true that people don't talk about this stuff?
Well, it's not, we're getting ready to have an election next week, and poverty reduction, hasn't been like center stage, right? I talked a little bit about Obama. We have the presidential candidates have different views on that, right? When you think of Obamacare, it's really poor people health care. It isn't framed that way when it's talked about. But if you take that away, I don't know, we expanded Medicaid, that goes away, right? But there's a lot of there's some middle class stuff in there, right? 26-year-olds get to stay on their parents' insurance policy. A lot of hands went up. Pre-existing conditions. If your dad loses his job and your mom has heart disease, and he gets another job at another employer, they can't not cover your mom's heart disease, right? That's what we got from that. So the presidential thing hasn't been as good. I think, and it hasn't been a state issue. We got campaigns raging right now for control of the Iowa legislature. Who's going to be in charge? Who's going to decide what we're going to do? That poverty is not that conversation. We talk about a little bit about Medicaid privatization, which is something that has to do with disabilities, seniors, poor people, and this disastrous decision the governor made to do something to turn it over to these big Wall Street companies. But I think there's a lot of places. I mean, you guys are students. You're going to have opportunities. We have an extremely strong human service network and safety net. You've met 3 of our top leaders. Wendy's done an awesome job as a state person, a state administrator of programs for people. I do policy stuff. Anybody in this room can do the jobs we do. There's lots of places in politics, in state government, and local community organizations to do good work. So lots of opportunities as you think about what you might do next.
And I think one of the things I'd encourage you to do when we talk about why or how we talk about poverty and poor folks is to just sometime Google entitlements. There are a bazillion entitlements in this country, and the only ones we tend to talk about are the ones that impact the poorest, most vulnerable people that we have. So I once got run out of a... I was young and energetic, and I went to a presentation with my boss to a bunch of... we were in a rural community with a ton of farmer families, okay? And they were really hard on people who were getting benefits. And at some point during the conversation, I said, now wait a minute. How many of you guys get paid not to plant? Isn't that welfare? Holy buckets, I wasn't sure if we were going to get off to the car in one piece. And we got to the car, and my boss looked at me and he said, that was brilliant. Don't ever do that again. Because it's like, if you go look at what entitlements are out there, whether it's tax credits for big business people, tax loopholes for rich people, if you really go look at entitlements, this country offers a bazillion entitlements to folks for different things in different groups. The only ones we tend to talk about are those that are really safety net services for the most vulnerable people we have. And so I think until we start the broader conversation about, all right, if we're going to talk about entitlements, let's talk about all of them, then I think we're going to continue to kind of have to struggle. But that's where we should be heading.
I don't think there's been much public will to do much about poverty in the last 50 years. So there have been moments in time when we've had conversations about making substantial and concentrated efforts to reduce the number of poor people, but it just doesn't seem to me that we've had that conversation for a long time. I mean, the last, my recollection, the last serious conversation we've had about poor people was in the mid-90s. When there were a lot of state initiatives that took off to reform welfare benefits for folks, and then followed by the large federal welfare reform initiative. So since then, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, we had a really substantive discussion about how are we going to reduce the number of poor folks in this country. So I guess if you don't really have the will to make change, what's the point in having a conversation about it?
There are a lot of localities, though, that talk a lot about the homeless, and what to do about the homeless. So that's a big issue, but I don't see a lot of federally, some initiatives, but not a lot to really solve the problem.
Please join me in thanking our panelists.